Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The fever had gripped Emma for 5 days straight, turning my 6-year-old daughter into a furnace that burned through blankets and my nerves alike. I pressed my palm against her forehead again, feeling the unnatural heat radiating from her small body. Her breathing came in short, wheezing gasps that made my chest tighten with each exhale. The pediatrician had assured me it was just a particularly nasty strain of flu, but sitting here at 2:47 a.m., watching her tiny chest rise and fall with difficulty, I wondered if we should have gone to the emergency room instead. The apartment felt smaller at night, the walls pressing in with each tick of the kitchen clock. I'd moved to this complex 3 months ago after the divorce, telling myself it was temporary, just until I could get back on my feet. The building sat at the edge of town, backed by dense woods that seemed to swallow sound and light alike. During the day, it felt peaceful. At night, it felt like being trapped in a box surrounded by darkness. My phone vibrated softly on the nightstand, the 3 a.m. medication alarm. I'd been setting it every 4 hours, religiously administering the fever reducer that barely seemed to make a dent. I eased myself off the edge of Emma's bed, my joints protesting after sitting in the same position for too long. She stirred slightly, mumbling something incomprehensible before settling back into her fitful sleep. The kitchen light felt harsh after the darkness of the bedroom. I squinted, fumbling through the cabinet for the sticky bottle of children's acetaminophen. That's when I noticed it, a bright white light cutting through the thin curtains of the sliding glass door that led to our small deck. It wasn't the amber glow of the parking lot lights or the occasional sweep of headlights from late-night traffic. This was different, stark, unforgiving, aimed directly into the woods behind our building. I approached the sliding door slowly, medicine bottle forgotten on the counter. Through the gap in the curtains, I could see a sedan parked at the far edge of the lot, its high beams creating a tunnel of light that penetrated deep into the tree line. The car wasn't running. No exhaust, no rumble of an engine. Just those lights, burning bright and steady, illuminating things that should have remained hidden in darkness. At first, I thought someone might be looking for a lost pet. It wouldn't be the first time. The woods were thick here, easy for a dog or cat to get turned around. But something about the stillness of the scene made my skin prickle. The car had been there for at least 10 minutes now, unmoving, its occupant invisible behind the glare. Then I saw movement at the edge of the light's reach. My first thought was deer. We had plenty of them around here, bold enough to wander into the parking lot looking for food. But the shape was wrong. Too low to the ground, moving with an odd lurching gait that made my stomach turn. As it crept closer to the light, I pressed my face against the glass, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The creature, because that's what it was, not an animal I could name, moved like liquid given form. Its body seemed to ripple and flow, never quite settling into a fixed shape. One moment it appeared canine, with 4 legs and a tail. The next it stretched and contracted like putty being worked by invisible hands. I watched, transfixed and horrified, as it shifted from what might have been a coyote into something resembling a large cat, then collapsed in on itself before expanding into a bulk that suggested a bear. My hands shook as I backed away from the door. This couldn't be real. Stress, lack of sleep, worry over Emma. My mind was playing tricks on me. But even as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen, I knew I needed someone else to witness this. Michael had always been the practical one in our marriage, the one who could explain away my anxieties with logic and reason. Even now, 3 months after our separation, I found myself needing his steady presence. I practically ran down the hallway to the spare room where he'd been sleeping during his weekend visits with Emma. We'd maintained this arrangement for her sake. When she was sick, we both stayed. I shook his shoulder roughly, whispering urgently for him to wake up. He groaned, mumbling about the time, but I didn't let up. I grabbed his arm and pulled, forcing him to his feet. "There's something outside," I hissed, dragging him toward the living room. "Something wrong. You need to see this." By the time we reached the sliding door, my heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Together, we peered through the curtains. The creature was still there, but it had moved closer, emerging from the woods into the full glare of the headlights. Under the harsh illumination, its wrongness was even more apparent. The way its form refused to hold, constantly shifting like smoke trying to become solid. Michael's sharp intake of breath told me he saw it too. We watched in horrified silence as the thing continued its approach, its body morphing through shapes that defied natural law. At one point, it appeared to have too many limbs, then not enough, then limbs in places where limbs shouldn't be. "What is that?" Michael's voice was barely a whisper, all his usual confidence stripped away. I couldn't answer. My throat had closed up, every instinct screaming at me to run, to grab Emma and get as far from this place as possible. But I remained frozen, watching as the creature paused in the middle of the parking lot. It had no discernible head, no eyes that I could see, but I felt its attention like a physical weight. It knew we were watching. Worse, it wanted us to watch. The thing began to move again, but now its transformations seemed more deliberate, almost like it was putting on a show. It would hold a form just long enough for us to recognize it. A dog, a raccoon, something that almost looked human crawling on all fours, before dissolving into that horrific state of flux. Each shape was wrong somehow, like a child's drawing come to life. All the parts present but assembled by something that didn't quite understand how they fit together. "We should call someone," Michael said, reaching for his phone. But his hand stopped halfway, and I knew why. Who would we call? The police? Animal control? What would we even say? The headlights flickered then, dimming momentarily before blazing back even brighter. In that brief darkness, the creature vanished. When the lights returned, it was gone, as if it had never existed at all. But the memory of it remained, burned into my retinas like the afterimage of staring at the sun. Michael left at dawn, making excuses about work, but I saw the fear in his eyes. He didn't want to stay another night, and I couldn't blame him. I spent the day in a haze, going through the motions of caring for Emma while my mind replayed what we'd seen. By evening, I'd almost convinced myself it had been some kind of shared hallucination. Stress could do that, right? Make two people see the same impossible thing. But as darkness fell, the dread returned. I found myself checking the locks obsessively, pulling the curtains tight, turning on every light in the apartment. Emma's fever had finally broken, and she slept peacefully for the first time in days. I envied her ignorance of what lurked outside our walls. At 2:45 a.m., I was on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, clutching a baseball bat I'd found in the closet. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it would come back, that it had unfinished business with us. The first sign was a faint glow through the curtains, not the harsh white of headlights, but something softer, more organic. It pulsed like a heartbeat, growing stronger, then fading, then returning. My grip tightened on the bat as I forced myself to approach the sliding door. This time, there was no car. The light came from the creature itself, a sickly luminescence that emanated from within its ever-shifting form. It sat at the edge of our deck, patient as a house cat, its body cycling through transformations with increasing speed. Dog, cat, bird, something insectoid with too many legs, human, not human, things that had no name. I watched, paralyzed, as it rose up on what might have been hind legs. In the pale light it generated, I could see details I'd missed before. Its surface wasn't fur or skin, but something in between, constantly moving like millions of tiny organisms swarming over a framework that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Where its face should have been was a smooth expanse that nevertheless gave the impression of watching, of waiting. It pressed against the sliding door, and I heard the glass creak under pressure that should have been impossible for something that seemed barely solid. A hand, or something hand-shaped, splayed against the glass, leaving behind a viscous residue that glowed faintly in the darkness. The fingers were too long, too many, bending in ways that made my eyes water trying to follow their movement. From behind me, a small voice. "Mommy?" I spun around to find Emma standing in the hallway, her favorite stuffed elephant clutched to her chest. Her eyes were wide but strangely calm, fever bright but focused. "It's been here before," she said quietly. "When you were sleeping. It watches through my window sometimes." The words hit me like ice water. I scooped her up, holding her tight as I backed away from the door. The thing outside pressed harder against the glass, and I heard a sound like grinding teeth or breaking bones. The frame groaned, and hairline cracks appeared in the glass. I barricaded us in Emma's room, pushing her dresser against the door, knowing it was a futile gesture but needing to do something. Emma sat on her bed, unnaturally calm, while I paced the small space like a caged animal. Outside, I could hear movement. Not footsteps exactly, but a wet sliding sound that circled the apartment. "What does it want?" I asked Emma, desperate for any information that might help us survive until dawn. She shrugged, a gesture too casual for the circumstances. "To come inside, I think. It's lonely out there." The words should have been innocent, childlike, but something in her tone made my skin crawl. How long had this thing been visiting her? What had it done to make her so accepting of its presence? A scratching sound came from the window, long, deliberate strokes like fingernails on a chalkboard. The blinds were closed, but I could see the glow seeping around the edges, pulsing in a rhythm that seemed almost like communication. Emma tilted her head, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. "It says you're being rude," she whispered. "It just wants to meet you properly." The scratching intensified, and I heard the window frame creaking. How strong was this thing? How solid could it become when it wanted to be? I grabbed Emma, ready to run, but where could we go? It was outside, surrounding us, patient and persistent. The night stretched on endlessly, marked by the sounds of the creature testing every possible entry point. The scratching, the pressing, the wet sliding sounds as it circled and circled. Emma had fallen asleep in my arms, apparently unbothered by the horror trying to get inside. I envied her peace even as I questioned what had been done to her to achieve it. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the blinds, the sound stopped. The glow faded. For a moment, I dared to hope it was over, that daylight had driven the thing away. I waited another hour before carefully moving the dresser and peering out into the hallway. The apartment was quiet, undisturbed. Slowly, I made my way to the living room. The sliding door was intact, though the residue remained, now dried to a crystalline crust that caught the morning light. Outside, the parking lot was empty, normal, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. On Emma's window, etched in the condensation, were words that made my blood freeze. "See you tonight." I packed our things within the hour, Emma chattering happily about visiting Grandma as if this was a planned vacation. As we loaded the car, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. At the edge of the woods, barely visible in the morning shadows, something watched. It didn't move, didn't shift, just waited. We drove away, but I knew with horrible certainty that distance wouldn't matter. It had found us once, it would find us again. And Emma, sweet Emma, would welcome it like an old friend when it did. The road stretched ahead, but all I could think about was nightfall, and what would come crawling out of whatever darkness we found ourselves in. Because now I understood, it wasn't tied to the apartment or the woods. It was tied to us, to her, and it was very, very patient. The desert has a strange way of quieting sound. Even though my cousins were laughing in the other room and the hum of the fridge buzzed softly, the quiet outside was unnerving. It wasn't just silence. It was the kind of stillness that felt alive. Like the desert was tense, waiting. I had just arrived that afternoon, bags still half unpacked in the corner of my cousin's tiny room. The adobe house was cozy, with its low ceilings and warm, earthy walls, but it felt like it was barely holding back the wilderness outside. I'd come to visit my mother's family for the annual fall festival, a tradition I hadn't participated in since I was 14. Now, at 26, I felt like a stranger in a familiar place. The reservation had changed, or maybe I had. Uncle Miguel had picked me up from the bus station in Gallup, his weathered pickup truck kicking up dust as we traveled the winding roads leading to their home. "Been too long, Nico," he'd said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Your grandmother's been asking about you." I nodded, guilt twisting in my stomach. It had been years since I'd visited, years spent in university and then working in Denver, building a life that seemed worlds away from this place. The endless horizon, the stark beauty of mesas rising in the distance, the smell of sage and dust. It all felt foreign now, like a half-remembered dream. The house sat isolated, a small adobe structure with a tin roof that gleamed silver in the harsh sunlight. Behind it stretched miles of open desert, broken only by scattered juniper trees and sagebrush. My uncle's sheep pen sat about 50 yards from the house, and beyond that, nothing but wilderness. As we pulled up to the house, the front door swung open, and my grandmother emerged, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, her face lined with age but her eyes sharp as ever. She embraced me tightly, smelling of herbs and wood smoke. "You've gotten too thin," she said, pulling back to examine me. "City life doesn't feed you right." "I eat fine, grandmother," I said, smiling despite myself. Some things never changed. Inside, the house was warm and filled with the smell of cooking food. My cousins, Mia and Lily, greeted me with hugs and rapid-fire questions about life in the city. My Aunt Nina kissed my cheek and pressed a mug of coffee into my hands. My grandfather nodded from his seat by the window, his weathered hands resting on his cane. "How long can you stay?" Mia asked, helping me carry my bags to the room we'd be sharing. "Just a week," I said. "I have to be back for work next Monday." She nodded, looking disappointed. "A lot can happen in a week," she said, and something in her tone made me pause. She seemed to catch herself and forced a smile. "Anyway, you're just in time for the festival. Everyone will be glad to see you." That afternoon, we drove to the community center where the fall festival was already in full swing. Tables laden with traditional foods lined the walls, and local artisans displayed their crafts. Children ran between the legs of adults, their laughter echoing in the large space. It felt good to be surrounded by the community again, to recognize faces and be recognized in turn. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot, I noticed a change in the atmosphere. People began packing up, conversations becoming hushed and hurried. By the time the sky turned deep purple, the festival had all but ended, with only a few stragglers remaining. "We should head back," Uncle Miguel said, checking his watch. "It's getting late." "It's barely 7, I said, confused. He exchanged a look with my aunt that I couldn't decipher. "People like to be home before full dark," he said simply. "It's just how it is out here." The ride back was quiet, the truck's headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. I stared out the window, watching as the stars emerged, brilliant and cold in the vast sky. There were no streetlights out here, no glow of a city on the horizon. Just darkness, deep and absolute. That night, after dinner had been cleared away, my family crowded around the dining table, swapping stories about people I hadn't seen in years and who was marrying who. It was the kind of harmless gossip that made the place feel alive, that connected people across miles of empty desert. Grandmother had made her special blue cornbread, and the sweetness of it still lingered on my tongue. Somewhere in the middle of it all, I asked the question. I didn't plan to. It just slipped out, casual and stupid. So, does anyone actually believe in skinwalkers? The room shifted. You wouldn't think a handful of words could drain the air from a space, but it did. Conversations sputtered, smiles faded. My grandmother, who had been stirring her tea, froze mid-motion. The spoon clinked against the cup as she set it down, her face pinched tight. "You shouldn't speak of such things," she said, her voice sharp and firm, like the crack of a stick snapping. That wasn't the reaction I expected. My cousins exchanged uneasy glances, and even my uncle, who could usually laugh off anything, looked like he wanted to bolt out of his chair. "What? Why?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant, but the words wavered. My grandmother's eyes darted to the windows. "You just don't. Not here. Not at night." For a moment, no one said anything. The tension hanging like the desert heat before a storm. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the distant howl of what I assumed was a coyote. Then my uncle cleared his throat. He wasn't looking at me when he spoke. "I've heard them," he said, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Few weeks ago, out by my sheep pen, screaming like a woman in pain, but it wasn't no woman." He didn't elaborate, and no one asked him to. I wanted to press for more. My curiosity practically screamed for it, but I could feel the weight of the room crushing down on me. My grandmother stood up abruptly, mumbling something about needing to check the windows. That was it. Conversation over. No one wanted to say another word. "I'm sorry," I said to the table at large. "I didn't mean to upset anyone." Aunt Nina patted my hand. "You didn't know," she said, but her smile was strained. We don't talk about those things. It's considered bad luck." "More than bad luck," Grandfather said, speaking for the first time that evening. His voice was gravelly, worn by years and cigarettes. "It's dangerous. Words have power out here. The desert listens." I wanted to laugh, to brush it off as superstition, but something in his eyes stopped me. He believed it, every word. And looking around the table at my family's faces, I realized they all did. "Let's play cards," Mia suggested suddenly, breaking the tension. "Nico used to be terrible at poker. Let's see if he's improved." The mood shifted, not back to what it was, but to something less heavy. Cards were dealt, jokes were made, and gradually the incident faded into the background. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. A door had been opened that shouldn't have been, and I had been the one to open it. Later, as we prepared for bed, I caught Mia looking at me strangely. "What?" I asked, pulling on my sleep shirt. She hesitated. "Nothing. Just... if you hear anything tonight, anything weird, just ignore it. It's probably just the wind or the house settling." What would I hear? She shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "Nothing. Forget I said anything." She climbed into her bed against the far wall, turning her back to me. I lay down on the guest mattress, staring at the wooden beams above me, listening to the creaks of the old house settling. The window was cracked open to let in the cool night air, but it did nothing to calm me. My uncle's words played on a loop in my head. Screaming like a woman, but it wasn't no woman. I must have eventually drifted off, because I woke with a start sometime in the dark hours of the night. The room was pitch black, and for a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then it all came back. The desert, my grandmother's house, the strange tension at dinner. The wind had picked up, whistling through the cracks of the old adobe. The soft rustle of mesquite branches brushing against the side of the house almost made me relax. Almost. Then I heard it. It started faint, just a low drag, like someone pulling a bag of rocks across gravel. I held my breath, convincing myself it was nothing, a stray dog or a loose tarp blowing in the wind. But it came again, closer this time. Drag, stop, drag, stop. I sat up slowly, my heartbeat drumming in my ears. The room was pitch black except for the pale glow of the moon slipping through the curtains. Mia was still asleep, her breath steady and oblivious. I tiptoed to the window and peered out. At first I saw nothing, just the yard, bathed in silvery light. The old truck sat rusting in its usual spot, and the ground was littered with scattered brush and a few broken-down tools. But then something moved near the truck. I squinted, my eyes adjusting to the faint light, and my stomach dropped. It looked like a dog, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its fur matted and patchy like it had been pulled from a sewer. The way it moved wasn't natural, jerky and deliberate, like it didn't quite know how to walk on four legs. Then it stopped, raising its head to look directly at me. The eyes. God, those eyes. They glowed a sickly yellow like burning sulfur, and they didn't blink. My knees locked and I couldn't look away. It tilted its head, studying me like a predator sizing up its prey. Then it opened its mouth, and the sound it made was like nails scraping across metal, a growl that wasn't quite animal, wasn't quite human. I stumbled back from the window, nearly tripping over a pair of shoes. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. I wanted to wake Mia, but my legs wouldn't move. The dragging sound started again, closer. This time it was coming toward the house. I pressed myself against the wall, staring at the window, terrified of what I might see next. The sound stopped just below the sill, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then came the scratching, slow, deliberate, as if whatever it was wanted me to know it was there. Each scrape against the adobe sent waves of terror through my body. It knew I was watching. It wanted me to hear it. I bolted straight to Mia, shaking her awake, my words tumbling out in panicked whispers. There's something outside. I saw it. It's right outside. She sat up groggily, annoyed at first, but her expression changed when the scratching came again, louder this time. Her face went pale. "We need to wake everyone," she whispered. As we crept toward the hallway, the stench hit, like rotting meat left to bake in the sun. It was so thick I gagged, covering my nose. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just an animal. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't here by accident. It was hunting, and it had seen me. The hallway was dark, but Mia seemed to know exactly where to step to avoid the creaky floorboards. I followed close behind, my hand gripping the back of her nightshirt. The scratching continued, moving from one window to another, as if testing each entrance. The sound seemed to be all around us now, encircling the house. "Mia," I whispered, "what is that thing?" She didn't answer, just kept moving toward our parents' room. But I saw her shoulders trembling, and I knew she was as terrified as I was. We reached my aunt and uncle's door first, and Mia pushed it open without knocking. The room was dark, but Uncle Miguel sat up immediately, his silhouette sharp against the faint light from the window. "What is it?" he asked, his voice instantly alert. "Something's outside," Mia said, her voice steadier than I expected. "It's circling the house." As if to confirm her words, the scratching came again, this time from somewhere near the back door. My Aunt Nina was awake now too, sitting up in bed, her hand reaching for the lamp. "Don't turn on the light," Uncle Miguel said sharply. "It will see us better." Those words sent a fresh wave of fear through me. Not it will see us, but it will see us better. As if it could already see us, through walls, through darkness. "What do we do?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. Uncle Miguel was already out of bed, pulling on his jeans. "We wake everyone. Now." The scratching didn't stop. Each drag of its claws on the door sent shivers down my spine, a slow, deliberate sound that seemed to mock us. Mia and I were frozen in the dark hallway, too scared to move, too scared to breathe. The smell of rot still hung in the air, thicker now, like it was seeping through the cracks in the adobe walls. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, but my mouth was dry and my heart was pounding so loud I was sure it could hear me. Mia grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of my own panicked breathing. "We wake everyone," I said, though my voice trembled so much I wasn't sure it even sounded like me. We crept down the hall, the old wooden floorboards creaking beneath our bare feet. The scratching stopped, and I froze mid-step. The silence was worse than the noise. I strained my ears, trying to hear anything over the blood rushing in my head. And then it started again, this time on the side of the house, just beneath the window we had been looking out of earlier. I almost screamed, but Mia yanked me forward. We reached my grandparents' room next, Mia knocking softly on the door. It opened almost immediately, as if they had been waiting for us. My grandmother stood there, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her face grave. "It's here, isn't it?" she asked, and Mia nodded. My grandfather appeared behind her, already dressed, a rifle in his hands. He looked at me, his eyes reflecting the same fear I felt, but there was something else there too. Determination. "Everyone to the living room," he said. "Now." Minutes later, we were all gathered in the living room. My grandparents, my aunt and uncle, my cousins, and me. The room felt too small, the air thick with fear, and the rancid smell of decay that refused to dissipate. My grandmother was clutching a small pouch of ash, muttering prayers under her breath in Navajo. My grandfather stood by the door, rifle in hand, his jaw set tight. "It's probably just a stray dog," my uncle said, though he didn't sound convinced. He peeked out the front window, careful not to get too close to the glass. "Maybe a coyote." "It's not a dog," I said, louder than I intended. Everyone turned to look at me, and I felt my face flush. I saw it. It's wrong. It's not natural. My grandfather's expression darkened. He glanced at my grandmother, who was still praying, and then back at me. "You looked at it?" he asked, his voice sharp. "I didn't mean to," I stammered. I thought it was a dog at first, but it wasn't. It had these eyes, glowing yellow-green, and it was looking right at me." My grandmother gasped, her hands trembling. "You never look at them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now it knows you." Her words sent a chill through me, but before I could respond, the scratching started again, this time louder, more aggressive. It was coming from the front door. The room went deadly quiet. Everyone was staring at the door, the sound filling the space, dragging against our nerves like nails on a chalkboard. My grandfather stepped forward, raising his rifle. "Stay back," he ordered, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. The scratching stopped again, replaced by something worse. A low, guttural whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, like words spoken in a language I couldn't understand. The sound seemed to vibrate in the air, crawling into my ears and burrowing into my brain. My stomach churned, and I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The whispering continued, rising and falling in pitch, sometimes so low it was almost inaudible, sometimes high enough to make my teeth ache. "What's it saying?" Mia whispered, her face pale as a sheet. "Don't listen to it," my grandmother snapped, her voice fierce. She threw a handful of ash toward the door and began chanting louder. The whispering stopped abruptly, as if cut off mid-sentence. Then came the thud. Something slammed into the door with such force that the whole house seemed to shake. My younger cousin Lily screamed, and Aunt Nina pulled her close, covering her ears. My grandfather raised his rifle, his hand steady despite his age. "Open it," he said to my uncle. "What?" Aunt Nina hissed. "Are you insane?" "We can't let it think we're scared," my grandfather replied. "Show it, we're ready to fight." My uncle hesitated, but the thudding came again, louder this time. He muttered a curse under his breath and grabbed the doorknob, his knuckles white. He flung the door open in one swift motion, and my grandfather stepped forward, aiming the rifle into the night. But there was nothing there. The porch light illuminated the yard, the ground scattered with dust and brush. The truck sat where it always had, and the surrounding desert stretched out, empty and quiet. But the smell lingered, and it was stronger now, so strong it made my eyes water. My grandfather stepped outside, scanning the darkness with his flashlight. "It's still here," he muttered. "I can feel it." That's when we heard it, a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. A laugh, high-pitched and distorted, like a coyote imitating a human. It echoed from somewhere in the darkness, and I could swear it was coming from every direction at once. My grandfather fired a shot into the night. The sound rang out, deafening in the stillness, but the laugh didn't stop. It only grew louder, more twisted, until it dissolved into a scream that made my skin crawl. "Get back inside," my grandmother yelled, pulling my grandfather by the arm. He hesitated, his eyes scanning the desert one last time before stepping back into the house. My uncle slammed the door shut, and my grandmother began sprinkling ash along the windows and doorframe, her prayers fast and urgent. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's out there?" No one answered immediately. Then my grandfather spoke, his voice low. "You know what it is. You asked about them at dinner." I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. "A skinwalker?" The word felt dangerous on my tongue, forbidden. My grandmother flinched at the word, throwing more ash toward the door. "We don't say that name," she hissed. "It draws them closer." "But those are just stories," I said, even as the memory of those glowing eyes made my heart race. "They're not real." "Tell that to whatever's outside," my uncle said, his face grim. "Tell that to my 3 dead sheep last month, throats torn out, but no blood on the ground. Tell that to Joe Begay's daughter who saw something that wasn't a man or an animal watching her from the edge of the yard last week." I swallowed hard. "What does it want?" "To cause harm," my grandmother said simply. "To spread fear, to take something from us." "What do we do?" Aunt Nina asked, holding Lily tighter. "We wait," my grandfather replied. "We stay together. We don't listen to its voice, and we don't look at it if it shows itself again." We stayed in the living room for the rest of the night, huddled together like children scared of the dark. The whispering didn't return, and the scratching stopped, but none of us could shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every creak of the house made us jump, and every shadow seemed to move. I sat by the window, careful not to look directly outside, but I couldn't help noticing the way the moonlight cast strange, shifting shadows across the yard. Twice, I thought I saw movement, a dark shape slinking between the sparse bushes, but I didn't tell the others. I couldn't be sure if it was real or just my imagination playing tricks on me. Lily eventually fell asleep on her mother's lap, her small face peaceful in slumber. Mia dozed against my shoulder, but I couldn't close my eyes. Every time I tried, I saw those glowing yellow-green orbs staring back at me. "It's my fault," I whispered to no one in particular. I said the name. I asked about them. My grandmother, who I thought had been sleeping, opened her eyes. "No," she said softly. "It was already here. It's been watching the house for days. You just gave it an opportunity." "Why?" She sighed, the sound heavy with years of knowledge I couldn't begin to understand. "Some say they were once men who chose a dark path, who gave up their humanity for power. Others say they were never human at all, but all agree they are drawn to fear, to doubt, to the spaces between what we know and what we believe. I don't understand. You left this place, she said, her eyes holding mine. You went away to the city, to your university. You learned new things, saw the world differently. You came back with one foot in each world, belonging to neither. That's the space they like best, the in-between. Her words unsettled me, not because they were accusatory, but because they rang true. I had felt it since I arrived. The disconnect, the sense that I no longer fully belonged here, but wasn't entirely comfortable in my city life either. What do I do? I asked, my voice small. Remember who you are, she said simply. Remember where you come from. Find your center, and hold to it. When dawn finally broke, it brought little relief. The desert looked the same, but it felt different. Like something had shifted. Something we couldn't see. My grandfather stood by the door, staring out at the horizon, his rifle still in his hands. It'll be back, he said quietly. And somehow I knew he was right. The morning light did nothing to ease the tension. It only made the fear feel sharper, more real. The shadows that had hidden in the night were gone, but the memory of those sounds, the scratching, the whispers, that unholy laughter, clung to the walls of the house like smoke. We were all still gathered in the living room, no one brave enough to drift far from the group. My grandmother sat by the window, clutching her pouch of ash, her lips moving silently in prayer. My grandfather hadn't slept. He stood by the door, his rifle cradled in his arms, staring out into the open desert as if daring it to try something in broad daylight. I hadn't slept either. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. Those glowing yellow-green eyes. The way it moved. That horrible laugh. I kept thinking about what my grandmother had said the night before. Now it knows you. After a tense breakfast, where no one ate much but everyone drank too much coffee, we decided to go outside together. Strength in numbers. The smell of rot still lingered in the air. Weaker now, but enough to make my stomach churn. The yard looked normal at first, just dirt, scattered brush, and the old truck. But then my uncle noticed the door. Deep, jagged claw marks ran across the wood in long, uneven streaks. The scratches were so deep they had splintered the surface. My uncle swore under his breath, running his hand over the marks. "That's no dog," he muttered. "No kidding," I said, unable to keep the tremor out of my voice. But the door wasn't the only thing. Around the base of the house, in the dirt, were tracks, big enough to look human, but wrong. The shape was off, with long, narrow toes that ended in claw-like indentations. They circled the house, stopping at the windows and the door. It had been watching us, moving from one side of the house to the other as we huddled inside. I felt my stomach drop, a cold wave of dread washing over me. Then Mia found the fur. It was caught on the edge of the old truck's bumper, a tuft of mangy, matted hair. She picked it up with a stick, holding it at arm's length. The smell was unbearable, a rancid stench that made us gag. It was coarse and wiry, stained with something dark and sticky. My uncle told her to drop it and immediately started covering it with dirt. "Don't touch it," he said, his voice hard. "Don't even look at it too long." By midday, my grandmother insisted on calling a neighbor, a medicine man who had helped our family before. His name was Gabriel Yazzie, an older man who lived about 10 miles away. I had met him a few times as a child, but he had aged considerably, his once black hair now streaked with silver, his face lined with deep wrinkles that spoke of years of desert sun. He arrived within an hour, an old pickup truck kicking up dust as it approached the house. He didn't ask many questions, just nodded solemnly as we explained what had happened. He examined the claw marks on the door, the tracks in the dirt, and the spot where Mia had found the fur, now covered with a mound of earth. "It's strong," he said finally, his voice gravelly. "And angry. It has fixated on your family, particularly you." He looked at me as he said this, and I felt a chill run down my back. "Can you help us?" my grandmother asked. Gabriel nodded slowly. "I can perform a blessing, create a barrier that will keep it from entering the house. But it's not easy. These things don't like to let go." He set to work immediately, gathering cedar and ash and creating a mixture he sprinkled around the house. He chanted as he worked, his voice low and rhythmic, a language I couldn't understand but felt deep in my chest. He marked the doors and windows with the ash, creating patterns that he said would block the creature from returning. As the blessing continued, I wandered toward the edge of the yard, drawn to the vast emptiness of the desert. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the brush. I stared at the horizon, searching for something I couldn't name when I felt it again. That prickling sensation, like I was being watched. I turned sharply, my eyes scanning the landscape. At first I saw nothing, just the endless stretch of dirt and rock. But then, far off in the distance, I saw movement. A figure, low to the ground, darting between the sparse bushes. My breath caught in my throat. It was fast, too fast to be anything normal. And the way it moved, jerky, unnatural, made my skin crawl. I backed up slowly, my heart racing. "Grandpa," I called, my voice barely above a whisper. He was by my side in an instant, his rifle in hand. "What is it?" he asked. I pointed, but the figure was gone. "I saw it," I said, my voice trembling. "It's still out there." He didn't doubt me. He just scanned the horizon, his grip tightening on the rifle. "Get back to the house," he said, his voice calm but firm. Back inside, Gabriel was finishing his blessing, the smell of burned sage and cedar filling the house, replacing the lingering stench of decay. He was speaking in Navajo, his voice rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence that seemed to make the air vibrate. My grandmother joined him, adding her voice to his, their words weaving together in a pattern I couldn't follow but felt the power of nonetheless. I watched from the doorway, not wanting to interrupt, but needing the reassurance of their presence. The sun was sinking lower, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple, and with each passing minute, I felt my anxiety grow. "It doesn't like this," Mia whispered, appearing beside me. "The blessing. It's angry." "How do you know?" I asked, though a part of me already knew the answer. She pointed to the window. Outside, the wind had picked up, swirling dust in small whirlwinds that danced across the yard. But there was something unnatural about the movement, too deliberate, too focused. It was like the wind was trying to reach the house, testing the boundaries of Gabriel's blessing. "What did you see out there?" Mia asked, her voice low. I hesitated. "I'm not sure. Something moving, too fast to be human or animal. It was watching us." She nodded, unsurprised. "It won't leave, you know. Not now that it's found us." "Found you." "Why me?" I asked, the question that had been gnawing at me since my grandmother's words in the night. "Why would it fixate on me?" Mia was quiet for a long moment. "You're different," she finally said. "You left, but you came back. You don't fully believe, but you're not a complete skeptic either. You're in between. It makes you vulnerable." Her words echoed my grandmother's from the night before, and I felt a chill run through me. What do I do? Let Gabriel finish the blessing. Stay inside tonight. Don't look out the windows no matter what you hear. Gabriel finished the blessing just as the sun dipped below the horizon. He warned us to stay inside for the night and to keep the windows shut no matter what we heard. "It may test the barrier," he said, "but it won't get through. Not if you don't invite it in." "What do you mean, invite it in?" I asked. His eyes were solemn. These things can't cross certain boundaries unless they're invited. A blessing creates a barrier, but it's not perfect. If you invite it, through fear, through curiosity, through doubt, it can find a way in. His words didn't make me feel any better. As darkness fell, the house seemed smaller, the walls thinner. The wind picked up, howling through the cracks like a distant scream. I sat by the window staring out into the night, every shadow and flicker of movement making my heart skip. Gabriel had gone home, promising to return in the morning to reinforce the blessing. My family moved around the house in hushed voices, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might attract unwanted attention. Lily was put to bed early, her mother staying with her, singing soft lullabies to drown out the sound of the wind. My grandfather kept his rifle close, checking and rechecking the locks on the doors and windows. My grandmother continued her prayers, her voice a constant, comforting murmur in the background. "You should try to sleep," Mia said, touching my shoulder. "You didn't sleep at all last night." I nodded, though I knew sleep would be impossible. "I'll try." In our shared room, I lay on the mattress, staring at the ceiling. Mia fell asleep quickly, her breathing deep and even. I envied her ability to find peace in sleep, to escape the fear that seemed to have taken up permanent residence in my chest. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time felt distorted, stretched thin by anxiety. The house creaked and settled, normal sounds that now seemed loaded with menace. I tried to focus on my breathing, tried to empty my mind, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes staring back at me. At some point, I must have drifted into a restless half-sleep because I woke with a start, my heart pounding. Something had changed. The room felt colder, the air heavy with a tension I couldn't name. I sat up, straining my ears. The wind had died down, leaving an unnatural stillness in its wake. Mia was still asleep, her face peaceful in the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. Then I heard it. A faint knocking at the window, soft but deliberate. My grandmother's words echoed in my head. "It knows you." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knocking stopped, replaced by the low, guttural whispering I'd heard the night before. It was outside, just beyond the thin glass, speaking in that horrible, inhuman voice. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. All I could do was sit there, frozen, as it whispered my name. Not the name everyone called me, but my full name, the one given to me at birth, the one only my grandmother used on rare occasions. "Nicholas Anthony Martinez," it whispered, drawing out each syllable like it was tasting the words. "I see you, Nicholas. I know you." I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the voice, but it seemed to be inside my head now, bypassing my ears altogether. I could feel tears streaming down my face, hot and shameful. "Go away," I whispered back, my voice breaking. "Leave us alone." The whispering stopped, replaced by that high, unnatural laugh. Then came the scratching again, not at the door this time, but at the window, right in front of me. Through the thin curtain, I could see a shadow, darker than the night around it, moving in jerky, uncoordinated motions. I should have woken Mia. I should have run to get my grandfather. But I was paralyzed with fear, unable to do anything but watch as the scratching continued. The curtain moved, just slightly, as if something was pulling at it from outside. I saw a glimpse of matted fur, a long, too thin limb that ended in claws that looked more like human fingers stretched and twisted into impossible shapes. "Nicholas," it whispered again. "Let me in. I'm so cold, Nicholas. So hungry." Its voice had changed, becoming almost piteous, pleading. But underneath the facade, I could hear the malice, the ancient, hungry evil that no amount of human mimicry could hide. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "You're not welcome here." The pleading stopped abruptly, replaced by a growl that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The scratching became more frantic, more aggressive. I could hear the glass creaking under the pressure, threatening to break. In desperation, I remembered my grandmother's words. "Find your center and hold to it." I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sounds, and thought of who I was, where I came from. I thought of my family, of the stories and traditions that had shaped me, even as I'd tried to leave them behind. "I know who I am," I whispered, my voice growing steadier. "And I know what you are. You have no power here." The scratching paused, as if my words had taken it by surprise. Then it came back, harder than before, the glass now audibly cracking under the strain. I leaped from the bed, finally breaking free of my paralysis, and shook Mia awake. "It's here," I gasped. "It's trying to get in." She was instantly alert, her eyes wide with fear. We ran from the room, waking the rest of the family. Within moments, everyone was gathered in the living room again, a replay of the night before. The scratching had moved from our window to the front door, a relentless, rhythmic sound that seemed to mock Gabriel's blessing. My grandmother was praying again, louder now, her voice strong despite her age. My grandfather stood with his rifle, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. What good would bullets do against something like this? "The blessing is holding," my grandmother said, her eyes on the door. "It can't get in unless we let it." "But for how long?" my uncle asked, his voice tense. "It's getting stronger." As if in answer, the door shuddered under a heavy impact. The whole house seemed to shake, dust falling from the ceiling beams. Lily began to cry, and Aunt Nina held her close, whispering reassurances that sounded hollow even to my ears. The assault continued through the night, the creature moving from one entrance to another, testing each window, each door, searching for a weakness in our defenses. The barrier held, but just barely. I could feel it straining, like a rope about to snap. As dawn approached, the attacks grew more desperate, more frenzied. The creature was running out of time, the coming light its enemy. With one final bone-jarring impact against the front door, it let out a scream of frustration that seemed to pierce through my skull. Then, silence. We waited, tense and ready. But nothing came. The first rays of the sun peeked over the horizon, slipping through the cracks in the curtains, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "Is it gone?" Lily asked, her small voice breaking the silence. "For now," my grandfather said, lowering his rifle. "It can't stand the daylight." But even as he spoke, I knew this wasn't over. The creature had marked me, had spoken my name. It would be back, night after night, until it found a way in or until I found a way to drive it away for good. Gabriel returned as promised, bringing more herbs and medicines to strengthen the blessing. He listened to our account of the night, his face grave. "It's stronger than I thought," he admitted, and more determined. "It is fixated on you, young one." He looked at me, his eyes reflecting a mixture of concern and resolve. "We will need to perform a stronger ceremony, one that will not just keep it out, but drive it away." "How?" I asked, exhaustion making my voice rough. "There is a place in the hills," he said, gesturing to the distant mesas. "A sacred site where the boundary between worlds is thin. We can perform the ceremony there, at sunset, when its power is weakest and ours is strongest." The day passed in a blur of preparation. Gabriel instructed us on what to bring, what to wear, what prayers to memorize. By late afternoon, we were ready, piling into 2 trucks for the drive to the mesa. The site was a small clearing surrounded by ancient petroglyphs, the rock art depicting scenes I couldn't interpret but felt the power of nonetheless. Gabriel directed us to form a circle, placing me in the center. As the sun began to set, Casting long shadows across the desert floor, he began the ceremony. The chanting started low, just Gabriel's voice. Then my grandmother joined in, then my grandfather, and soon all of us were part of it, our voices rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to come from somewhere deep within us. I felt something shift in the air, a tension building like before a storm. The wind picked up, swirling around us, carrying dust and small stones. For a moment, I thought I saw shapes in the dust, formless things that twisted and writhed just beyond the edge of the circle. Gabriel's voice rose above the wind, commanding, powerful. He spoke words I didn't understand but felt the weight of. The shapes in the dust seemed to recoil, drawing back as if burned. Then I heard it again, that low, guttural whisper calling my name. It was here, watching, waiting. I could feel its rage, its hunger, its determination to break through our defenses. "Don't listen," Gabriel warned, his eyes locked with mine. "It's trying to distract you, to make you doubt. Stay focused on the ceremony." I nodded, forcing myself to concentrate on the chanting, on the rhythm of the ritual. But the whispering continued, growing more insistent, more enticing. It was offering me things now, knowledge, power, secrets that no human should know. For a brief, terrifying moment, I felt myself wavering. A part of me wanted to listen, wanted to understand what this thing was, what it knew. But then I remembered my grandmother's words. "Find your center and hold to it." I closed my eyes, blocking out everything but the sound of my family's voices, the feeling of the earth beneath my feet, the warmth of the setting sun on my face. This was who I was. This was where I belonged, not in some in-between space, but firmly rooted in my heritage, my family, my home. The whispering faltered, then grew more frantic, more desperate. I opened my eyes to see the dust cloud surrounding us churning violently, those half-seen shapes now thrashing as if in pain. Gabriel's voice reached a crescendo, and with one final, powerful word, he threw a handful of mixed herbs and ash into the air. The dust cloud seemed to explode outward, the shapes within it dispersing with what sounded like a distant, agonized scream. Then, silence. The wind died down, the dust settled, and the only sound was our own breathing, ragged and exhausted. I felt something release, a tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying since I first looked out that window and saw those glowing eyes. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice hoarse from chanting. Gabriel looked at me, his eyes tired but satisfied. "Yes, it's gone. The barrier is sealed." The drive back to the house was quiet, everyone lost in their own thoughts. The desert night surrounded us, but it didn't feel threatening anymore. The stars overhead seemed brighter, more welcoming. That night, for the first time since I'd arrived, I slept without dreaming. No scratching disturbed the silence. No whispers invaded my thoughts. Just peace, deep and complete. In the morning, I knew I would have to face the reality of returning to the city, to my job, to the life I had built so far from this place. But something had changed within me. The line between the world I had grown up in and the world I had chosen was no longer a barrier. I could belong to both, carry both within me. As I packed my bags, Mia watching from her bed, I felt a sense of resolution, of completion. Whatever that thing had been, a skinwalker, a manifestation of ancient evil, or just a physical embodiment of my own disconnection from my roots, it had forced me to confront something essential about myself. "Will you come back?" Mia asked as I zipped my suitcase closed. I nodded, knowing it was true. Yes, sooner this time. She smiled, relief evident in her eyes. "Good. You belong here too, you know. Not just out there." "I know," I said, and for the first time, I really did. The desert has a strange way of quieting sound, of making you listen to what's important. Even as my uncle's truck kicked up dust on the road back to the bus station, I could hear it. The silent promise I had made to myself, to my family, to this place. To remember who I was, where I came from. To never again drift into that dangerous in-between space where things with glowing eyes and whispered promises could find me. Some might say it was just a wild animal, a trick of the light, a family's shared delusion fueled by ancient superstitions. Sometimes in the bright lights and constant noise of the city, I might even believe that myself. But when the night is quiet and the world grows still, I remember those eyes. I remember that voice, whispering my name. And I know that some things in this world defy explanation, that some boundaries should not be crossed, and that sometimes the old ways, the old beliefs, exist for a reason. The desert knows. The desert remembers. And now so do I. I remember my mom used to say that life is a series of calculated risks, and I always thought she was right. I'm Brett McAllister, a guy who has spent most of his life calculating those risks. A mechanical engineer by trade, I've always believed in the reliability of numbers and the precision of machines. But numbers and machines couldn't prepare me for what I encountered in the Oregon wilderness. Growing up in Portland, I was never far from nature. The Pacific Northwest, with its lush forests and rugged coastlines, had always been my playground. Weekends were often spent hiking trails, fishing in crystal-clear streams, or simply sitting by a campfire, watching the stars emerge in the night sky. There was something about the wilderness that spoke to me, a primal call that resonated deep within my soul. As I grew older and my career took off, those wilderness excursions became less frequent. The demands of my job at a prestigious engineering firm in downtown Portland left little time for extended camping trips. But the yearning never faded. It was always there, a persistent ache in my chest, a longing for the simplicity and raw beauty of nature. That's why, when I finally managed to secure a few days off work, there was no question about how I'd spend them. I dusted off my old RV, a 1985 Winnebago that had seen better days but still ran like a charm, thanks to my meticulous maintenance. I stocked up on supplies, checked and double-checked my gear, and set my sights on the Tillamook State Forest. The Tillamook State Forest had always held a mystique for me. Located just 40 miles west of Portland, it was a vast expanse of nearly 364,000 acres of forest, stretching across the northern Oregon Coast Range. I'd heard tales of its beauty, of hidden waterfalls and secluded campsites, of trails that wound through ancient groves of Douglas firs and western hemlocks. It was a place I'd always meant to explore but had never found the time. As I pulled out of my driveway early on a crisp September morning, I felt a sense of excitement I hadn't experienced in years. The city streets were quiet, the first rays of sunlight just beginning to peek over the horizon. I navigated through the sleepy suburbs, the RV humming steadily beneath me, until I hit Highway 6 heading west. The drive was nothing short of spectacular. As I left the city behind, the landscape transformed. Rolling hills gave way to steeper terrain, the road winding its way through dense forests. Shafts of golden sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating a dappled pattern on the asphalt. The air grew crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. I rolled down the windows, letting the cool mountain air flood the RV. The radio crackled with static before settling on a local station playing classic rock. As the familiar strains of Hotel California filled the air, I couldn't help but smile. It felt like a good omen, a sign that this trip was exactly what I needed. About 2 hours into the drive, I turned off the main highway onto a smaller, more rugged road. The pavement gave way to gravel, and the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees here were massive, their trunks wider than my RV, their branches forming a thick canopy overhead that blocked out much of the sky. I drove slowly, carefully navigating the winding road. The RV creaked and groaned as it tackled the uneven terrain, but it held steady. I'd always trusted this old girl, and she'd never let me down before. As I delved deeper into the forest, the sense of isolation grew. I hadn't passed another vehicle in over an hour, and the only sounds were the crunch of gravel under my tires and the occasional call of a bird high in the treetops. It was exactly what I'd been looking for, a complete escape from the noise and chaos of city life. After another hour of careful driving, I spotted what I was looking for, a small turnoff that led to a clearing just visible through the trees. It was perfect, tucked away from the main road and surrounded by towering firs. I carefully maneuvered the RV off the road and into the clearing, feeling a sense of satisfaction as I finally cut the engine. For a moment, I just sat there, letting the silence wash over me. It was a profound quiet, broken only by the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze and the occasional chirp of a bird. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension of the past few months begin to melt away. As I stepped out of the RV, the forest seemed to embrace me. The air was cool and damp, filled with the earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating patches of warmth on the forest floor. I stretched, feeling my muscles protest after the long drive, and took in my surroundings. The clearing was small but perfect for my needs. There was enough space for the RV and a campfire, with room left over for my camping chair and a small table. The ground was carpeted with a thick layer of pine needles, soft underfoot. At the edge of the clearing, a small game trail disappeared into the underbrush, promising exploration opportunities. I spent the next hour setting up camp, falling easily into the familiar routine. I leveled the RV, set up my camping chair, and gathered wood for a fire. As I worked, I felt the last vestiges of stress from my city life melt away. Here, in the heart of the forest, deadlines and project specs seemed a world away. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, I decided to take a short hike before dinner. I grabbed my backpack, made sure I had water and a few snacks, and set off down the game trail. The forest was alive with the sounds of evening, birds calling to each other, small animals rustling in the underbrush, the distant sound of water trickling over rocks. The trail wound its way through the trees, sometimes so faint I could barely make it out. But I wasn't worried about getting lost. I'd always had a good sense of direction, and I made sure to note landmarks as I went. A lightning-struck tree here, an unusually shaped boulder there. After about an hour of hiking, I came across a small stream. The water was crystal clear, bubbling over smooth river rocks. I sat on a fallen log, pulled out a granola bar, and just listened to the sound of the water. As I sat there, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. This was why I loved the wilderness. This sense of connection to something greater than myself. This reminder of the raw beauty of the natural world. As the light began to fade, I made my way back to camp. The hike back seemed shorter, and before long I could see the clearing through the trees. The sight of my RV, a little piece of civilization in the midst of the wilderness, brought a smile to my face. I got a fire going as night fell, the flames casting a warm glow over the clearing. The crackling of the fire mixed with the night sounds of the forest, the hoot of an owl, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. I cooked a simple dinner of hot dogs roasted over the fire, washing it down with a cold beer from the RV's fridge. As I sat there, watching the flames dance and listening to the forest around me, I felt more at peace than I had in years. The worries and stresses of my everyday life seemed far away, insignificant in the face of this ancient forest. I thought about what my mom used to say about life being a series of calculated risks, and I realized that sometimes the best things in life come from taking a chance, from stepping out of your comfort zone and into the unknown. Little did I know, as I sat there basking in the warmth of the fire and the serenity of the forest, that my beliefs about calculated risks and the unknown were about to be tested in ways I could never have imagined. The peace of that evening was the calm before a storm that would shake the very foundations of my understanding of the world. As the night deepened, the noises of the forest became more pronounced. The chirping of crickets created a constant background hum, punctuated by the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant call of a coyote. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, flickering light across the clearing. I leaned back in my chair, nursing my second beer of the evening, and gazed up at the sky. Away from the light pollution of the city, the stars were breathtaking. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light, and I found myself picking out constellations I hadn't seen since I was a kid camping with my dad. It was in this moment of quiet contemplation that I first heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a discordant note in the symphony of the forest. At first, it was so faint I thought I might have imagined it, a low rumbling noise, like the growl of an engine, but deeper, more primal. I sat up straighter, straining my ears. For a long moment, there was nothing but the normal sounds of the night. Then I heard it again, closer this time. It was followed by a series of thuds, like something heavy moving through the underbrush. My heart rate picked up, and I felt a prickle of unease run down my spine. I stood up, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the dying firelight. My mind raced through the possibilities. A bear, maybe? Or a cougar? I'd seen the warning signs at the park entrance about local wildlife. But this didn't feel right. I've been around enough animals to know what they sound like. And this was different. There was an intelligence to it, a deliberateness that sent a shiver down my spine. I debated with myself for a moment, then decided to investigate. I grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight from the RV and swept the beam across the edge of the clearing. The trees cast long, flickering shadows, but nothing seemed out of place. The forest looked as it had all day, dense, dark, and impenetrable beyond the first few rows of trees. The sound came again, louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from my left, deeper in the forest. I swung the flashlight in that direction, my heart pounding in my chest. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating tree trunks and underbrush, but revealing nothing unusual. I took a few steps towards the tree line, my feet crunching on the carpet of pine needles. The night suddenly felt oppressive, the darkness beyond my flashlight beam seeming to press in around me. I could feel sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool night air. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement just at the edge of the flashlight's beam. Something large, moving with surprising speed between the trees. I caught a glimpse of matted fur, a hulking shape that seemed too big to be real. My breath caught in my throat. Whatever this thing was, it was no ordinary forest animal. It was massive, far larger than any bear or cougar I'd ever heard of. And it moved with a purpose, an intelligence that made my blood run cold. I knew I should retreat, get back to the safety of the RV, and wait out the night. But something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe stupidity, or maybe something deeper, a need to confront whatever was out there to understand it. The forest had gone eerily quiet. Even the crickets had fallen silent. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart in my ears. I swept the flashlight back and forth, searching for another glimpse of the creature. Suddenly, there was a tremendous crash of breaking branches, followed by a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the trees. The sound wasn't human, at least not entirely. It had a sharp, almost metallic edge to it, like the grinding of gears. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight in my shock. My finger tightened on the switch, and the beam swung wildly across the forest. And that's when I saw it clearly for the first time. The creature burst from between two massive firs, moving with impossible speed for something so large. My breath caught in my throat as the light fell fully on it. It was covered in thick, matted fur, dark and bristling like the quills of a porcupine. But it wasn't the fur that froze me in place. It was the size. This thing was enormous, easily over 8 feet tall, with a hulking, muscular frame that rippled with every movement. Its limbs were long and powerful, ending in claws that looked like they could tear through steel. And then I saw its face, or at least what I thought was its face. It had a grotesque, twisted snout that resembled a wild boar's, with tusks jutting out on either side like jagged knives. But the worst part was its mouth. It was wide, almost impossibly wide, lined with rows of teeth that seemed to glint in the flashlight's beam. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I felt a primal fear unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Its eyes were not the eyes of an animal. There was an intelligence there, a malevolence that chilled me to my core. For a split second, neither of us moved. We were frozen in a tableau of terror, me, a fragile human armed with nothing but a flashlight, and this thing, this impossible creature that shouldn't exist in any sane world. Then, with a roar that shook the very air around us, it charged. I did the only thing I could. I ran. I dropped the flashlight and bolted for the RV, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs moving on pure adrenaline. The ground was uneven, and I stumbled more than once, but I didn't dare look back. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush with a terrifying speed that made my blood run cold. I reached the RV, fumbling with the door handle in my panic. I could feel the creature's hot breath on the back of my neck as I finally wrenched the door open and threw myself inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage it. Through the window, I could see the creature. It circled the RV, its massive form blocking out the starlight. It let out another of those terrible screams, a sound that reverberated through the metal of the RV and seemed to shake me to my very bones. I scrambled into the driver's seat, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal. The RV lurched forward, tires spinning in the soft earth before finding purchase. I tore out of the clearing and onto the narrow forest road, branches scraping against the sides of the RV like desperate fingers trying to hold me back. In the rearview mirror, I saw the creature burst out of the tree line, its eyes glinting in the darkness. It was gaining on me, its massive limbs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. The RV's tires skidded on the loose gravel as I took a sharp turn, the vehicle tilting dangerously before righting itself. But the thing kept coming, relentless, unstoppable. I knew there was no outrunning it, not on this road, not in this vehicle. And then, without warning, it leapt. A massive, impossible leap that carried it over the RV, landing with a thud on the road in front of me. I swerved, barely missing it, but the RV hit a patch of loose gravel and skidded sideways. I felt a moment of weightlessness as the RV tipped, then a sickening crunch as it slammed into a tree. The impact threw me forward, my head slamming into the steering wheel. For a moment, everything went black. When I came to, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The engine had died, and the forest around me was as quiet as a tomb. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, aware of a warm trickle of blood running down my forehead. The creature was gone. I don't know how long I'd been unconscious, but there was no sign of the monstrous thing that had chased me. I sat there for a long moment, my breath coming in ragged gasps, waiting for it to reappear. But the forest remained still and silent. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up in the seat. The windshield was a spider's web of cracks, and steam hissed from the crumpled hood. The RV was totaled, its front end wrapped around the trunk of a massive fir tree. I fumbled with the door handle, my movements clumsy and uncoordinated. When I finally managed to push the door open, I half fell out of the RV, landing hard on the gravel road. The cool night air hit me like a slap, clearing some of the fog from my mind. I staggered to my feet, using the RV for support. My whole body ached, and my head throbbed where it had hit the steering wheel. But I was alive. Somehow I was still alive. I looked around, half expecting the creature to come charging out of the trees again to finish what it had started. But the forest remained still. the only sound the crackling of the damaged engine and the gentle rustle of leaves in the night breeze. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at the wreckage, trying to piece together what had happened. My mind was a fog, the events of the night swirling together in a chaotic blur. But one thing was clear. I couldn't stay there. With shaking hands, I managed to gather what little I could from the RV. My backpack, a bottle of water, my phone, miraculously unbroken but with no signal, and a small first aid kit. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed the tire iron from under the seat. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it made me feel a little less vulnerable. As I stepped away from the wreck, the forest seemed to close in around me. Every shadow held a potential threat. Every rustle of leaves made me flinch. But I forced myself to keep moving. I knew I had to find help, or at least get back to civilization. I started walking, following the gravel road. I had no idea if I was heading towards safety or deeper into danger, but I couldn't bring myself to venture off the road into the dark forest. My flashlight was gone, lost in my mad dash to escape the creature, so I had to rely on the faint moonlight filtering through the trees to guide my way. As I walked, my mind raced. What was that thing? How could something like that exist? I'd always prided myself on my rational, scientific mindset. I dealt in facts, in measurable, quantifiable data. But what I'd seen tonight defied all logic, all reason. It simply couldn't be real. And yet the ache in my body and the wreck of my RV were very real reminders that what I'd experienced was no dream or hallucination. I don't know how long I walked. Hours blended together, each bend in the road looking the same as the last. My legs ached, my head throbbed, and fear was a constant companion. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush made me whirl around, tire iron raised, ready to face the monster again. But it never came. Whatever that thing was, it seemed content to let me go. Or maybe it was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The thought made me quicken my pace, ignoring the protests of my battered body. As the first light of dawn began to seep through the trees, I finally saw something that gave me hope. A battered wooden sign pointing towards a ranger station 5 miles down a forking road. My relief was so profound I almost wept. Those 5 miles were the longest of my life. Every step was an effort, my body running on nothing but adrenaline and the desperate need to reach safety. But finally, as the sun crested the horizon, I saw it. A small wooden building with a green roof, the words, Tillamook State Forest Ranger Station, painted above the door. I practically fell against the door, my fists pounding on the wood. "Help!" I croaked, my voice hoarse from hours of disuse. "Please, is anyone there?" The door swung open, revealing a startled-looking ranger. He took in my battered appearance, the wild look in my eyes, and quickly ushered me inside. "Good Lord, son, what happened to you?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again. How could I possibly explain what I'd seen? Who would believe me? I settled for a simplified version of the truth. There was something in the forest. My RV crashed. I've been walking all night. The ranger, a kind-faced man in his 50s named Bob, didn't press for details. He sat me down, brought me water and a first aid kit, and called for medical assistance. As we waited for the paramedics to arrive, he tried to keep me talking, probably worried about shock or concussion. "What were you doing out there alone?" he asked gently. I let out a bitter laugh. "Trying to get away from it all. Guess I succeeded a little too well." When the paramedics arrived, they checked me over, cleaned and bandaged my head wound, and recommended I go to the hospital for a more thorough examination. I nodded numbly, beyond arguing. As they were loading me into the ambulance, Bob approached, his face creased with concern. "Listen, son," he said quietly. I don't know what you saw out there, but you're not the first. There have been stories, rumors. Just be careful who you talk to about this, all right? I stared at him, a chill running down my spine despite the warm morning sun. He knew something, or at least suspected. But before I could ask any questions, the paramedics closed the ambulance doors, and we were off. In the following days, as I recovered in the hospital, I had a lot of time to think. The police came to take my statement about the crash. I gave them the same story I'd given Bob, vague details about swerving to avoid an animal, losing control on the gravel road. They seemed satisfied, though I caught a few odd looks, probably wondering what I was doing so deep in the forest in the middle of the night. I was discharged after a few days, diagnosed with a mild concussion, various cuts and bruises, and what the doctors diplomatically referred to as acute stress reaction. In other words, they thought I was traumatized, maybe hallucinating. Part of me wanted to believe them, to dismiss what I'd seen as the product of fear and concussion. But I knew better. I haven't been back to the Tillamook State Forest since that night. I don't think I ever will. My love for the wilderness, once so central to who I was, has been tainted. Now, when I look at the trees on the horizon, I don't see peace or beauty. I see shadows, and I wonder what might be lurking within them. Sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the darkness presses in, I hear that sound again. That low, rumbling noise that doesn't belong in this world. And I wonder about what's out there, about the things that lurk in the spaces between what we know and what we fear to know. I think about what my mom used to say, about life being a series of calculated risks. She was right in a way. But now I know that some risks can't be calculated, that there are things in this world that defy all logic and reason. And sometimes, the best we can do is survive the encounter and live to tell the tale. As for me, I've returned to my life in the city. I go to work, I see friends. I try to pretend that everything is normal. But I know it's not. I've seen behind the veil, glimpsed a world beyond our understanding, and I can never unsee it. So I keep moving forward, one day at a time, always aware of the shadows at the edge of my vision. And I wonder, not for the first time, what other secrets the wilderness might be hiding, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor to stumble upon them. My name is Richard Brown, and I am 68 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me on September 12, 1983, when I was 35 years old. It's a story I've carried with me for over 3 decades, one that still sends shivers down my spine whenever I recall those fateful days in the Bitterroot National Forest of Montana. It was the autumn of 1983, and my life felt like it was falling apart at the seams. I had just finalized my divorce from Sarah, my wife of 10 years. We had married young, straight out of college, full of dreams and ambitions. But as the years went by, we grew apart, our lives taking different paths. The divorce was amicable, but it left me feeling hollow, questioning every decision I'd ever made. I was working as a high school English teacher in Missoula at the time. The new school year had just begun, but I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that had settled over me. One Friday afternoon, after the last bell had rung and the hallways had emptied, I found myself sitting alone in my classroom, staring at the faded posters of Shakespeare and Hemingway on the walls. It was then that I made a spontaneous decision. I needed to get away, to clear my head and figure out what to do next with my life. I owned an old RV, a 1975 Winnebago Brave that I had bought on a whim a few years back, dreaming of family road trips that never quite materialized. It had been sitting in our, now my driveway for months, gathering dust and serving as a constant reminder of unfulfilled plans. But now, it seemed like the perfect escape vehicle. That evening, I packed up some clothes, basic supplies, and my fishing gear. I left a note for my sister, Karen, letting her know I was taking a short trip to the Bitterroot National Forest. "Don't worry," I wrote. "I just need some time to think. I'll be back in a week." Little did I know how that week would change my life forever. The next morning I set out early, the sun just beginning to peek over the eastern horizon as I pulled out of Missoula. The drive to the Bitterroot National Forest took about 2 hours, the scenery gradually changing from the urban sprawl of Missoula to the rugged beauty of western Montana. I drove past small towns like Lolo and Florence, watching as the Bitterroot Mountains loomed larger on the horizon. I had chosen the Bitterroot National Forest for its relative obscurity. While places like Glacier National Park drew crowds of tourists, the Bitterroot was quieter, wilder. It was a place where I could truly be alone with my thoughts. As I drove deeper into the forest, following winding roads that seemed to grow narrower with each passing mile, I felt a sense of anticipation building in my chest. The towering pines and firs created a canopy overhead, dappling the road with shadows. The air grew cooler, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was late afternoon by the time I found a suitable clearing to set up camp. I maneuvered the RV off the main road, following a rough trail until I reached a small meadow surrounded by dense forest. A babbling stream ran along one edge of the clearing, promising good fishing prospects. I parked the RV and stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. The silence was almost overwhelming after the constant hum of city life. Here, the only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant calls of birds. As I began to set up camp, my mind wandered back to the events that had led me here. I thought about Sarah, wondering what she was doing at that moment. Was she also trying to find her way in this new, separate life we had chosen? I shook my head, trying to clear away these thoughts. I was here to forget, at least for a while. I spent the remaining daylight hours setting up a small campfire pit and gathering firewood. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, I fired up the RV's small propane stove and grilled a couple of hot dogs. It wasn't much of a dinner, but out here, with the scent of pine and wood smoke in the air, it tasted better than any fancy restaurant meal. After dinner, I sat by the fire, nursing a beer and watching as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens, a sight I had almost forgotten existed after years of living under city lights. As I sat there, I felt a sense of peace settling over me. Maybe this trip was exactly what I needed. That first night passed uneventfully. I slept soundly in the RV, lulled by the gentle sounds of the forest. When I awoke the next morning, I felt refreshed and ready to explore my surroundings. After a simple breakfast of instant coffee and granola bars, I decided to spend the day hiking and fishing. I packed a small backpack with water, some snacks, and my fishing gear. As an afterthought, I scribbled a note and left it on the RV's small dining table. Gone hiking and fishing, following the stream to the east, back by sunset. Richard. It seemed silly, leaving a note when there was no one around to read it, but old habits die hard. The day was perfect for hiking, cool but not cold, with a light breeze that kept the mosquitoes at bay. I followed the stream that ran past my campsite, marveling at the beauty of the forest. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating dazzling patterns on the forest floor. The undergrowth was thick in places, forcing me to push through ferns and berry bushes. As I hiked, I found my mind wandering to the future. What did I want to do with my life now? Should I stay in Missoula, or was it time for a fresh start somewhere new? The questions that had seemed so overwhelming back in the city now felt more manageable, as if the forest air had cleared my mind as well as my lungs. By early afternoon, I had hiked several miles upstream. The terrain had grown steeper, with the stream now tumbling over rocky cascades. It was here that I decided to try my luck at fishing. I found a promising pool below a small waterfall and set up my gear. Fishing had always been a form of meditation for me. the repetitive motion of casting, the focus required to watch for any movement in the water. It all served to quiet my racing thoughts. Time seemed to slow down as I stood there, my line drifting in the clear mountain water. After about an hour, I had caught 2 decent-sized trout. It was more than enough for dinner, so I packed up my gear and began the hike back to camp. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming earlier, now felt watchful. I brushed it off as my imagination running wild after too many hours alone. It was late afternoon by the time I made it back to the clearing where I had parked the RV. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the meadow. As I approached my campsite, a strange scent caught my attention. It was faint but unmistakable, a sickly sweet odor that reminded me of rotting meat. My first thought was that some animal had died nearby. It wasn't uncommon in the wilderness, after all. But as I got closer to the RV, the smell grew stronger, and a sense of unease began to creep over me. Something was wrong. The RV's door, which I distinctly remembered closing and locking before I left, now stood ajar. My heart began to race as I approached cautiously, calling out, "Hello? Is someone there?" There was no response, just the oppressive silence of the forest. With shaking hands, I pushed the door open wider and peered inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The interior of the RV was a disaster. It looked as if a whirlwind had torn through the small space. Cabinets were flung open, their contents strewn across the floor. The cushions of the small dinette were shredded, stuffing spilling out like some grotesque parody of snow. But it was the walls and floor that truly horrified me. A dark, viscous substance was smeared across every surface. It looked like blood, but thicker, almost black in the fading light. The smell that had caught my attention earlier was overwhelming now, a stench of decay that made me gag. I stumbled backward out of the RV, my mind reeling. What could have done this? A bear, maybe? But I had never heard of a bear behaving like this, and the destruction seemed almost deliberate. As the initial shock wore off, I forced myself to think rationally. I needed to assess the damage, salvage what I could, and get out of there. Whatever had done this might still be nearby. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and re-entered the RV. I grabbed my backpack, which thankfully had been in the cab and was untouched, and began shoving whatever useful supplies I could find into it. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every sound from the forest outside made me jump. It was as I was zipping up the now full backpack that I heard it. A rustling sound from just beyond the clearing. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again, closer this time, accompanied by a sound I can only describe as a low, melodic whistle. My heart pounding, I peered out the RV's window. The sun had set, leaving the forest shrouded in twilight shadows. At first, I saw nothing. Then, a movement caught my eye. Something large was moving through the underbrush at the edge of the clearing. I caught a glimpse of a hunched shape, too tall and thin to be a bear. Panic seized me. I needed to get out of there now. But the thing, whatever it was between me and the road. My only option was to hunker down in the RV and hope it would leave. I quickly closed and locked the door, then turned on every light in the RV. The sudden brightness was jarring after the gathering darkness outside. I grabbed my hunting knife from my pack. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. And sat at the small table, my eyes fixed on the door. The night that followed was the longest of my life. Every creak of the RV's frame, every whisper of wind outside, sent a fresh wave of terror through me. Several times I heard that eerie whistling sound, sometimes close, sometimes farther away, as if the thing was circling the clearing. At some point, exhaustion must have overtaken me because I jerked awake to the sound of scratching at the door. It was a deliberate sound, slow and rhythmic, like something testing the strength of the barrier between us. I sat there, knife clutched in my sweating hand, barely breathing as I listened to the scratching. It went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. I don't think I slept again, every nerve in my body on high alert. When the first light of dawn finally began to filter through the windows, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I had made it through the night. As soon as it was light enough to see clearly, I cautiously opened the RV's door and peered outside. The clearing looked peaceful in the early morning light, with no sign of the terror that had gripped me during the night. The air was crisp and clean, the foul odor from the previous evening completely gone. I stepped outside, scanning the area for any signs of what had happened. To my amazement, there were no tracks, no broken branches, nothing to indicate that anything had been there. If it weren't for the destroyed interior of the RV, I might have thought I had imagined the whole thing. Not wanting to stick around to find out if the creature, whatever it was, would return, I quickly packed up what I could and prepared to leave. As I was doing a final check of the campsite, something caught my eye. There, at the edge of the clearing where I had first seen the shape the night before, was a small tuft of something. I approached cautiously and bent down to examine it. It looked like fur, but unlike any I had ever seen. It was coarse and wiry, with an oily sheen that seemed to shift colors in the morning light. I hesitated for a moment, then pulled out a small plastic bag from my pack and carefully placed the tuft inside. If nothing else, it was proof that I hadn't imagined everything. With one last look around the clearing, I climbed into the RV and started the engine. As I drove down the winding forest road, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see something loping after the RV. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching out behind me. It was mid-morning by the time I reached the small town of Darby, the first sign of civilization since I had entered the forest. My nerves were shot, and I desperately needed fuel, both for the RV and for myself. I pulled into a small gas station on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s. As I was filling up the RV, the station attendant came out to check on me. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with a weathered face and kind eyes. His name tag read, Frank. "You all right there, son?" he asked, his voice gravelly but concerned. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I must have looked a sight, exhausted, disheveled, and probably wild-eyed with fear and lack of sleep. For a moment, I considered brushing off his concern with some vague explanation. But something in his expression made me pause. He looked understanding, as if he had seen this before. I'm not sure," I said finally, my voice shaky. "Something happened up in the forest. Something I can't explain." Frank's expression grew serious. He glanced around as if making sure no one else was within earshot, then said in a low voice, "Why don't you come inside? Looks like you could use a cup of coffee and maybe we can talk about what happened." I nodded gratefully, finished filling up the RV, and followed Frank into the small convenience store attached to the gas station. He gestured for me to sit at a small table in the corner while he poured 2 cups of coffee from an ancient-looking percolator. As we sat there, the aroma of strong black coffee filling the air, I found myself pouring out the whole story. I told Frank about the destroyed RV, the strange smells, the noises in the night, and the glimpse I had caught of something in the forest. To his credit, Frank listened without interruption, his face growing more grave with each detail. When I finished, Frank sat back in his chair, a thoughtful look on his face. "You're not the first to come down from those woods with a story like that," he said finally. "Folks around here, they call it the Whistler." "The Whistler?" I repeated, a chill running down my spine at the name. Frank nodded. "Been stories about it for generations. Some say it's a spirit, others think it's some kind of animal that hasn't been discovered yet. All I know is that people have gone missing up there over the years. Hikers, campers, even a few locals who should have known better. I sat there, trying to process what Frank was telling me. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as local superstition, but after what I had experienced, I couldn't simply brush it off. What do you think it is? I asked hesitantly. Frank shrugged. Wish I knew. All I can tell you is to count yourself lucky. Not everyone who encounters the Whistler comes back to tell the tale. We sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of Frank's words hanging in the air between us. Finally, he spoke again. Look, I know a fella who might be able to tell you more. Name's Tom Jenkins. He's something of a local expert on the forest and its oddities. If you're interested, I could give him a call, see if he'd be willing to talk to you. I hesitated. Part of me wanted nothing more than to get in the RV and drive as far away from this place as possible. But another part, the part that had always been drawn to mysteries and unanswered questions, was intrigued. Maybe this Tom Jenkins could provide some answers, some explanation for what I had experienced. Yeah, I said finally. Yeah, I'd like to talk to him. Frank nodded, seeming unsurprised by my decision. He got up and went to the store's ancient rotary phone, dialing a number from memory. I could hear him speaking in low tones, though I couldn't make out the words. After a few minutes, he came back to the table. Tom says he can meet you this afternoon if you're up for it. He's got a cabin just outside of town. I can give you directions if you want. I nodded, feeling a mix of anticipation, and Frank gave me directions to Tom Jenkins's cabin, a hand-drawn map on the back of an old receipt. I thanked him for his help and the coffee, then set out. The drive took about 30 minutes, winding through back roads that grew progressively more remote. Finally, I turned onto a narrow dirt track that led to a small clearing. Tom's cabin was a sturdy-looking structure of rough-hewn logs with a porch that wrapped around two sides. Smoke curled from the chimney, and I could see a figure moving behind the windows. As I parked the RV, the cabin's door opened and a man stepped out. Tom Jenkins was not what I had expected. In my mind, I had pictured a grizzled old mountain man. Instead, I was greeted by a man probably in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He was dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt, looking more like a college professor than a backwoods expert. "You must be Richard," he called out as I approached. Frank called ahead. Said you had quite a story to tell. We shook hands, and Tom invited me inside. The cabin's interior was cozy but cluttered, every surface covered with books, maps, and what looked like scientific equipment. He gestured for me to sit in a worn armchair while he busied himself making tea. Once we were settled, mugs of steaming tea in hand, Tom leaned forward, his eyes intense. "So, tell me what happened up there in the forest." I recounted my experience again, trying to remember every detail. Tom listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification but otherwise remaining silent. When I finished, he sat back, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You're not crazy, Richard," he said finally. "What you encountered up there, well, it's something I've been studying for years." "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Tom sighed. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure, but I can tell you what I do know." He got up and went to a large map of the Bitterroot National Forest pinned to one wall. Red pins dotted various locations. "Each of these pins represents a reported sighting or encounter," he explained. "They go back decades. Whatever this thing is, it's been in these woods for a long time." He turned back to me. "The locals call it the Whistler, as I'm sure Frank told you. From the accounts I've gathered, it seems to be some kind of creature, possibly not of this world. It's attracted to certain people, certain places. No one knows why." "But what does it want?" I asked. Tom shook his head. "That's the million-dollar question. Some think it's hunting. Others believe it's collecting. Studying us, maybe. All I know is that people have disappeared over the years. Not many, and not often enough to raise major alarms, but enough to create a pattern. He paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. There's something else, he said finally. Something I haven't shared with many people. I've found artifacts, things left behind after encounters. My hand went to my pocket, where I had stored the bag containing the strange fur I had found. Like this? I asked, pulling it out. Tom's eyes widened as he took the bag. He examined the contents closely, his expression a mix of excitement and concern. Yes, exactly like this. Where did you find it? I told him about the tuft of fur at the edge of the clearing. Tom nodded, his mind clearly racing. This is incredible, he murmured. I've never had a sample this fresh before. We spent the next few hours discussing the Whistler, with Tom sharing some of the other stories he had collected over the years. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself drawn into the mystery. Despite my fear, I couldn't help but be fascinated by the idea that there was something out there, something unknown to science. As the sun began to set, Tom looked at me with a serious expression. Richard, I know this might sound crazy, but would you be willing to go back up there with me? To the spot where you had your encounter? I hesitated. The thought of returning to that clearing filled me with dread. But at the same time, I felt a pull, a need to understand what had happened to me. When? I asked. Tomorrow, Tom replied. We'll go prepared this time. I have some equipment that might help us gather more information. I took a deep breath, weighing my options. Finally, I nodded. Okay, I said. Let's do it. The next morning dawned clear and cold. I had spent the night in my RV parked outside Tom's cabin. Despite the lingering fear from my experience, I had slept soundly, exhaustion finally catching up with me. Tom was already up when I emerged from the RV, loading gear into an old Jeep. He had an assortment of scientific equipment, cameras, audio recorders, and some devices I didn't recognize. He also had 2 rifles, which he assured me were just precautionary. We set out just after sunrise, the Jeep bouncing along the rough forest roads. As we drove, Tom explained more about his research. He had been studying the Whistler phenomenon for over a decade, ever since his own encounter in these woods. He had never seen the creature clearly, but like me, he had experienced its presence. The government knows about it, he told me as we drove deeper into the forest. Or at least some parts of the government do, but they've kept it quiet. Can you imagine the panic if people knew there was something out here, something we can't explain? I nodded, understanding the logic but feeling uneasy about the secrecy. As we neared the area where I had camped, that feeling of unease grew stronger. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less menacing, but no less mysterious. We parked the Jeep a short distance from my original campsite and proceeded on foot. Tom moved with the quiet confidence of someone familiar with the wilderness, his eyes constantly scanning our surroundings. I felt clumsy and exposed in comparison, every snapping twig under my feet sounding like a gunshot in the quiet forest. As we entered the clearing where I had parked my RV, I felt a chill run down my spine. Everything looked normal. There were no signs of the destruction I had witnessed, no lingering smell of decay. If I hadn't lived through it myself, I would have thought it was just another peaceful spot in the woods. Tom immediately set to work, setting up cameras and other equipment around the perimeter of the clearing. He took samples of soil and vegetation, carefully bagging and labeling each one. I helped where I could, but mostly I just watched, still trying to reconcile the peaceful scene before me with the terror of that night. As the day wore on, nothing out of the ordinary happened. We heard the usual forest sounds, birds calling, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. but nothing that suggested the presence of something larger or more sinister. It was late afternoon when things changed. I was helping Tom adjust one of his cameras when I felt it. A sudden drop in temperature, as if all the warmth had been sucked out of the air. Tom felt it too. I saw him stiffen, his hand going to the rifle slung over his shoulder. Then we heard it. That low, eerie whistle that had haunted my dreams since that night. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the trees. "Get ready," Tom whispered, his voice tense. "It's coming." We stood back to back in the center of the clearing, weapons at the ready. The whistling grew louder, closer. The forest had gone completely silent, as if every living thing was holding its breath. Suddenly there was movement at the edge of the clearing. Something large and dark detached itself from the shadows of the trees. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, almost gliding across the ground. As it entered the clearing, I got my first clear look at the whistler. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but much taller and thinner than any person. Its body seemed to shimmer, as if it wasn't quite solid, but it was the face, or rather the lack of one, that truly terrified me. Where features should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse, like a mask made of shadow. Tom was shouting something, but I couldn't make out the words over the pounding of blood in my ears. The creature, the whistler, turned its eyeless face toward us. The whistling sound grew to a deafening pitch. What happened next is still a blur in my memory. I remember Tom firing his rifle, the sound impossibly loud in the confined space of the clearing. The whistler moved with incredible speed, closing the distance between us in the blink of an eye. I felt something brush past me, a sensation of intense cold that seemed to penetrate to my very bones. Then Tom was on the ground, the whistler looming over him. Without thinking, I raised my own rifle and fired. The creature recoiled, making a sound like tearing metal. It turned its attention to me, and for a moment, I was certain I was going to die. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting back into the shadows of the forest. The silence that followed was deafening. I rushed to Tom's side, fearing the worst. But he was alive, though badly shaken. We gathered our equipment as quickly as we could and fled the clearing, not stopping until we reached the jeep. The drive back to Tom's cabin was tense and silent. We were both trying to process what we had seen, what we had experienced. It wasn't until we were safely inside, doors locked and a fire blazing in the hearth, that we began to talk. "It's real," Tom kept saying, his voice a mix of fear and excitement. "After all these years, we finally have proof." But as we reviewed the footage from the cameras and analyzed the data from Tom's equipment, we realized that our proof was frustratingly inconclusive. The cameras had malfunctioned at the crucial moment, leaving us with only brief glimpses of movement and shadow. The audio recordings captured the whistling sound, but little else. We had experienced something extraordinary, something that defied explanation. But we had no way to prove it to the world. In the years since that day in the Bitterroot National Forest, I've often questioned my memories of what happened. Did we really encounter something unknown to science, something potentially not of this world? Or was it all some kind of shared delusion, born of fear and suggestion? Tom Jenkins continued his research, becoming something of a local legend in the process. He published papers and gave lectures, but without concrete proof, his theories were largely dismissed by the scientific community. As for me, I left Montana shortly after our encounter. The experience had shaken me to my core, making me question everything I thought I knew about the world. I traveled for a while, trying to find some sense of normalcy before eventually settling in a small town on the Oregon coast. I never went camping again. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows in from the sea, I think I hear a faint whistling sound. It's probably just the wind, I tell myself. But a part of me wonders, is the whistler out there still, roaming the dark places of the world? And if it is, what does it want? I don't have answers to these questions. All I know is that there are things in this world that we don't understand, things that lurk just beyond the edge of our perception. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just catch a glimpse of them. So if you find yourself in the wilds of Montana, in the shadows of the Bitterroot Mountains, and you hear a strange whistling on the wind, my advice is to turn around and leave. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I never should have come to Utah. That's what I keep telling myself as I sit here in this trailer, hands trembling so badly I can barely type. My name is Michael, and 3 days ago, my life became a waking nightmare. It was supposed to be a simple job. My friend Josh and I had driven out to this desolate stretch of land to do some surveying work for a small construction company. The pay was good, almost suspiciously good, but we needed the money and the work seemed straightforward. The property sits about 20 miles from the nearest town, bordering a Native American reservation roughly 200 feet to the east. Nothing but scrubland, dust, and silence. The first day went fine. We set up our trailer, organized our equipment, and even managed to get a decent amount of work done before sunset. We grilled some burgers outside, had a few beers, and talked about what we'd do with the money. Josh was saving for a new transmission for his motorcycle. I was just trying to pay off some debt. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m., not sure what had disturbed me. The air felt dense, almost pressurized, like the moment before a severe storm. I lay there in the darkness, listening to Josh's steady breathing from the other side of the trailer, trying to identify what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it. A soft, deliberate scratching along the outer wall. Not the random scraping of a branch or bush, but something purposeful, something with intent. I convinced myself it was just an animal, a coyote or maybe a raccoon, and eventually fell back into an uneasy sleep. I didn't mention it to Josh the next morning. No reason to seem paranoid over what was probably nothing, but that was the beginning. That was when it found us. By the second day, we both knew something was wrong. "Do you smell that?" Josh asked, wrinkling his nose as he climbed into the truck to fetch some equipment. I did. It was unmistakable, the sickening stench of sulfur mixed with the nauseating sweetness of rotting meat. The smell permeated everything, seeping into the upholstery and clinging to our clothes. "Did you leave something in here?" I asked, helping him search the truck. We checked under seats, in the glove compartment, even pulled up the floor mats. Nothing. When we returned to the trailer that evening, the same putrid odor greeted us there too. We spent an hour searching, checking every corner, cabinet, and crevice. The trailer was clean, spotless even, yet the stench remained, growing stronger as the hours passed. That night, the scratching returned. No longer confined to one wall, it moved around the trailer, sometimes on the roof, sometimes near the windows. Accompanying it was a new sound. A rhythmic tapping, like knuckles against glass. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. "You hear that, right?" Josh whispered from his bed. "Yeah," I replied, my mouth dry. "I hear it." "What the hell is it?" I had no answer. Here in the vastness of the Utah wilderness, 20 miles from civilization, there shouldn't be anyone or anything capable of making those sounds. The tapping continued for hours, stopping only with the first pale light of dawn. Neither of us slept. How could we, with that persistent reminder that something was outside, something that wanted in? On the third day, we abandoned any pretense of working. The smell had grown so intense that we could barely stand to be in the truck or trailer. Our eyes watered constantly, and my stomach churned with nausea. "We need to figure out what this is," Josh said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "Whatever's out there, I'm tired of being hunted." I nodded in agreement, though every instinct screamed against the idea of pursuing whatever was stalking us. But Josh was right. We couldn't continue like this, jumping at every sound and unable to sleep. We needed answers. As dusk approached, we gathered our equipment, powerful flashlights, a rifle Josh had brought just in case, and our phones with location services enabled in case we got separated. We set out on foot, following a narrow game trail that led away from our camp and deeper into the empty landscape. The temperature dropped rapidly as darkness fell. Wind whispered through the sparse vegetation, carrying dust that stung our eyes and throat. We walked in silence for nearly 2 miles, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, revealing nothing but rocks and stunted plants. Then, without warning, the sulfur stench hit us like a wall. "We're close," Josh whispered unnecessarily. I could feel it too, a heaviness in the air, a wrongness that made my skin crawl. I swept my flashlight in a wide arc, searching the darkness. The beam caught something, a brief reflection, like eyes gleaming in the night. And then it was gone. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Before Josh could answer, we both froze. Silhouetted against the night sky, approximately 50 yards ahead, stood a figure. Tall, impossibly tall, at least 6 or 7 feet in height. It was unnaturally thin and completely motionless. Even at that distance, I could feel its attention fixed solely on us. "Josh," I whispered, unable to tear my gaze away from the figure. "Josh, what is that?" The figure moved, not a step, not a walk, but a sudden, unnatural rush toward us. Its limbs moved wrong, too fluid and too jerky all at once, covering ground at an impossible speed. We ran. There was no discussion, no plan, just pure animal fear propelling us back toward our truck. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror pushed me forward. I could hear Josh beside me, his breathing ragged and panicked. Behind us, gaining with every second, came the sound of pursuit. Not the pounding of feet, but something else. A strange, sliding whisper across the ground, punctuated by sharp cracks like breaking twigs. We reached the truck, fumbling with the doors in our panic. Inside, the stench was overwhelming, but it was our only chance. I turned the key, and the engine sputtered, but wouldn't catch. Come on, I pleaded, trying again. Nothing. Josh swore, his face ghastly pale in the dim light. "It's getting closer." I made a decision. "I need to check the engine. Keep watch." Stepping out into the night was the hardest thing I've ever done. The cold air hit me like a physical blow as I moved to the toolbox mounted on the truck's side. My hands shook violently as I grabbed a wrench and began removing the intake cover. Every second felt like an hour. Every sound in the darkness sent fresh waves of terror through me. I worked by feel as much as sight, spraying ether into the intake and hastily reassembling it. "Hurry!" Josh's voice came from inside the cab, high and tight with fear. I slammed the hood down and dove back into the driver's seat, turning the key again. This time, the engine roared to life. I threw it into gear and floored the accelerator, tires spinning in the loose dirt before finding purchase. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but empty land ahead. The speedometer climbed. 30, 40, 50. But then stopped at 53 miles per hour. The engine whined but wouldn't go faster. "Something's wrong," I said, pressing harder on the pedal. "It should be able to hit at least 70. Josh was twisted around in his seat, staring out the rear window. "It's still coming," he said, his voice hollow with disbelief. I checked the rearview mirror and felt my stomach drop. Behind us, moving with the same unnatural speed, was the figure. Despite our head start and the truck's speed, it was gaining on us. "It's not possible," I whispered, watching as it drew closer. "Nothing can run that fast." "Floor it!" Josh screamed. "It's right behind us." I pushed the pedal to the floor, but the truck refused to accelerate beyond 55. The engine struggled, making a high-pitched whine that seemed to mirror my own internal screaming. The mile back to our trailer stretched into an eternity. Every second, I expected to feel hands, or something worse, grabbing at the truck, pulling us back into the darkness. We reached the trailer and abandoned the truck, not even bothering to shut it off properly. We sprinted the short distance to the door, threw ourselves inside, and slammed it shut behind us. Josh turned the deadbolt while I grabbed blankets to cover the windows. "What was that thing?" Josh gasped, sliding down against the wall. I shook my head, unable to form words as I frantically covered the last window. The moment I finished, something hit the door. Not a knock, but a violent impact that made the entire trailer shudder. "It found us," I whispered. Josh grabbed a kitchen knife while I positioned myself against the door, feeling it vibrate with each new impact. The pounding stopped suddenly, replaced by the sound of something scraping along the trailer's exterior, circling us. Then, impossibly, the deadbolt began to turn on its own. I watched in horror as the lock slowly rotated toward the open position. Josh saw it too, and threw himself against the door with me. "Find something to block it," I shouted. He grabbed a bootlace from his work boots and tied it around the lock mechanism, securing it in the locked position. The knob continued to turn against the restraint, the lace stretching but holding. I grabbed a hammer, pathetic defense but better than nothing, and stood ready. We waited in terrified silence, listening to the thing outside as it continued to circle the trailer. My phone buzzed in my pocket, making me jump. I pulled it out with shaking hands and saw a text from Megan, a girl I'd been interested in for months but who never responded to my messages. "I'm in trouble. Need you to come get me right now," the text read. I showed it to Josh, who frowned. "That's weird timing," I replied, asking what was happening. "Getting kicked out of the house. Please hurry." Something felt wrong. Why would she contact me now, after months of silence? And how did she even know where I was? I asked if she had money for diesel. A question that would make no sense if she didn't know I was out of town in my truck. Her reply sent ice through my veins. "Why would I want to see you? We haven't talked in months." "She didn't send the first messages," Josh whispered, looking from the phone to the door, which had finally stopped moving. That's when the voices started, coming from just outside the trailer, familiar voices calling my name. My brother's voice, my mother's voice, even Josh's voice somehow, despite him sitting right beside me. "Michael, please help me. Michael, I'm hurt out here. Michael, let me in." Each voice was almost perfect, but with something subtly wrong, an inflection slightly off, a rhythm not quite human. We survived that night through a combination of luck and desperation. Josh remembered something his grandmother had taught him about protective circles of salt. We found a container in the kitchen and poured lines across every threshold. Whether it actually helped, or the thing simply grew tired of tormenting us, the voices eventually stopped, and the oppressive feeling of being watched began to fade. Neither of us slept. We sat back to back in the center of the trailer, weapons in hand, jumping at every creak and groan of the metal structure around us. Dawn arrived with agonizing slowness. As the first gray light filtered through the covered windows, the atmosphere changed. The heaviness lifted, and the rotten smell that had permeated everything began to dissipate. When we finally worked up the courage to look outside, we found nothing. No footprints in the dust. No scratches on the trailer's exterior. No sign that anything had happened at all. "Maybe we imagined it," Josh said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. I shook my head. "Both of us? The same thing?" We checked the truck next. It started immediately, the engine purring normally. When Josh tested it on the dirt road, it easily hit 70 miles per hour. We should have left then. Packed up and driven away, job be damned. But where would we go? I had no home to return to, having given up my apartment to take this job. Josh was in a similar situation, and some irrational part of me worried that leaving wouldn't matter, that whatever had found us would simply follow. So I sat down and began writing everything that had happened, hoping that documenting it might help me make sense of it. or at the very least, leave a record if things went badly. By mid-afternoon, we'd worked up the courage to venture to the reservation. If anyone would know what we were dealing with, it would be the people who had lived on this land for generations. We drove slowly, the truck performing perfectly now, as if nothing had ever been wrong with it. The reservation appeared abandoned at first glance, small clusters of buildings with few signs of life. We stopped several vehicles on the main road, asking for information, but were met with suspicious stares and brief, unhelpful responses. "Nobody knows where the tribal office is?" Josh asked after our fifth unsuccessful attempt. An elderly man in a passing pickup finally pointed us toward a small building at the reservation's edge. "Council meets there," he said, "but they won't talk to you." He was right. The building was locked, with a sign indicating office hours only 2 days a week. Today wasn't one of them. As we turned to leave, a young woman approached us from a nearby house. "You're the one staying on the Lyman property," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I admitted. "We're having some problems." She nodded, unsurprised. "That land has history. Bad things happened there." "What kind of bad things?" Josh pressed. She looked uncomfortable. "I shouldn't talk about it. But whatever you've seen or heard, it's not what you think. It's not one of our legends come to life." "Then what is it?" I asked. "Some places hold memory," she said after a long pause. "And some memories are hungry. They feed on fear." She turned to go, then looked back. "Salt helps. Prayer helps more. Don't acknowledge it. Don't give it power." It wasn't the answer I'd hoped for, but it was something. A framework for understanding, and more importantly, for fighting back. On the drive back, we stopped at a gas station and bought every container of salt they had. The clerk gave us an odd look, but said nothing. "Do you really think this will work?" Josh asked as we outlined our trailer with thick lines of salt. "I don't know," I admitted. "But what other options do we have?" That night we prepared differently. Instead of hiding, instead of cowering in fear, we followed the woman's advice. We created barriers of salt around the trailer and the truck. We left a single light on but covered the windows. And most importantly, we refused to listen. The scratching started earlier this time, more frantic, more insistent. The smell returned too, but somehow less potent. My flashlight flickered occasionally, but I chose to believe it was just the batteries failing. "Ignore it," I reminded Josh when the voices began again. "Don't give it power." We sat together in the center of the trailer, back to back, and I did something I hadn't done in years. I prayed. Not elaborate prayers, just simple, honest pleas for protection, for strength, for morning to come quickly. The entity seemed to sense our change in strategy. Its attacks grew more desperate, the trailer shaking with impacts, the voices shifting from familiar to monstrous, inhuman growls and screeches punctuated by words that made no sense. But we held firm. We didn't respond. We didn't look. We didn't acknowledge the horror just outside our walls. And slowly, gradually, it began to recede. By morning, the silence was complete. Not just the absence of the entity's noises, but a deeper quiet. The natural sounds of the desert returning. Birds called in the distance. Wind rustled through the scrub, normal sounds that had been absent during the entity's presence. We ventured outside cautiously, half expecting to find some sign of the previous night's assault, but again there was nothing. Just dust and rocks and open sky. That day, we acquired a dog from a shelter in the nearest town. A large mixed breed with alert ears and a deep bark. If nothing else, he would serve as an early warning system. The dog showed no signs of distress or awareness of anything unusual. He explored the area around the trailer with typical canine enthusiasm, barking at rabbits and digging in the dirt. It's been 2 days now with no further incidents, no smells, no sounds, no sinister texts or calls. The dog remains calm and happy. Even the oppressive feeling of being watched has dissipated. I don't know what was hunting us out here in the Utah wilderness. I don't know why it chose us or why it seems to have left. Was it the salt? The prayers? Our refusal to engage with it? Or did it simply move on to easier prey? Whatever the truth, I'm writing this as a record and a warning. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. I've felt their attention, I've heard their voices, and I hope to God I never do again. For now, we continue our work, but we maintain our precautions. Salt lines are refreshed daily, prayers are spoken at dusk, and we never, ever answer when something calls our names in the darkness. Because some calls aren't meant to be answered. Some voices aren't meant to be heard. And some things that hunt in the night should be left to hunt alone.